Lise was an advisor to one of the co-chairs of the French Climate Convention, which basically meant, as far as I'm concerned, Lise was responsible for organising a lot of the climate convention, because I know the person who she was working for couldn't have that much time to do it. So Lise was really involved in that amazing project in France. She then worked with European Climate Foundation and was one of the inventors or founders of the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies. And it's been a real pleasure over the last 18 months to work so closely with Lise. Our relationship has blossomed so much that she left, and she now works advising an administration in a major French city. So it's a real pleasure to have Lise here. She actually has intimate knowledge of the governance committee. She wishes she didn't have, probably, but she has intimate knowledge of the French governance committee, but she'll also be talking more widely about this issue of governance. So Lise, it's a real pleasure to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you, and hello everyone. Sorry, it's a bit weird at first. I need to get accustomed to that. And once again, I'm very sorry for joining that late in the spring school, and I'm sure I missed very interesting contributions, aside from the one just before. That was not that great. And do not hesitate to write anything that passes through your mind through that QR code. I hope everything is anonymized. Yeah, I assume so. So thanks. So we're gonna start by talking a bit about the French Citizens Convention for Climate. It's the only time I'm going to talk, to mention that name. I'll be calling it the CCC, to save us some time, because we have 50 slides to go through, so it's a bit long. Kidding there, only 49. So we're going to start just by going through the French Climate Assembly, how it worked, how it was, to quote Graham Smith, an outlier amongst climate assemblies when you look at certain aspects. And then we're going to look more closely at its governance structure, and then how it worked, and how others were set. So it's quite important to stress, when you think about the French Climate Assembly, that it happened, so the genesis happened 3 years ago, 4 years ago, whoa, yeah, 4 years ago, when France at the time was going through major protests, one being the Yellow Vests. I think that most of you know what they were protesting about and what this movement was, though it was sometimes a bit misrepresented by the media and is still not very well understood in France. But we also had the youth climate movement happening at the same time, with the climate strikes from the youth, and big demonstrations that happened throughout the world, in France as well. And those two protests were happened and led the government to react with what the French president called the Great National Debate. That was a process organized on pretty much everywhere in France, and that was due to try to channel, let's say, the very many demands that the people who were marching at the time had. There were over 2 million contributions. I think the real number is much more higher than that. And it was probably a bit hard for the government to try to come up with one unique and single answer. So on the 25th of April 2019, the French president that is here, who is here, announced that he was, among the many different answers to what was going on in the streets, that he would organize a citizens' convention on ecological transition. So that set out the start of a process or actually of a marathon, but at the time we thought it was a sprint. We had very little time to organize a big thing. And most of the arrangements of this convention, that was actually the Citizen Assembly, were made through a mission letter that was addressed by the Prime Minister to the President of an institution in France that is a bit specific, that is the Economic, Social and Environmental Committee that we inherited from the aftermath of Second World War. when there was the idea to set up this assembly as a way to allow for trade unions and civil society organizations to be represented and have a say in the nation's policies. Nevertheless, it's not as powerful as Parliament. It's not as listened to as Parliament. But this institution was the one to hold this citizen assembly. So the letter said that the remit of the assembly was to design structural proposals for France to cut its emissions, greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 by 40% compared to the levels of 1990, in a spirit of social justice. So that was really the connection to what was happening and the many social demands that led the youth, the Yellow Vests to protest. The letter missions decide or says that I want you, the president of ESSEC, to organize this panel of 150 members that needs to be representative of the French population and to have a mini France. There will be sessions that you need to organize, 6, by January 2020. You will set up a governance committee with members from the ESSEC and non-ESSEC members. By the time the letter was published, there had been already negotiations about who was going to be in the governance committee or not, but I'll come back to that later on. And the logistical support and the place where the debates would happen was the ESSEC Palace that is set up here, that is in Paris. And yeah, so the first element that was very important that the governance committee focused on was organizing the participants' recruitment. We used a private company that did generated through software random numbers, phone numbers. You had like landlines and phone lines, and they started to call them to present, saying, we're calling because we're recruiting for a citizens' assembly. They were explaining what a citizens' assembly is and what was the purpose, as stated by the mission letter. People would say yes or no. We would give them a couple of days to say yes or no, etc., and call them back. We had a very good response rate. Probably due to the fact that at the time the ecological transition and green issues were quite high in the among the concerns that people had, and we had seen that in the protests in the EU elections polls and results. At the time also we had a new institution that started in France, the High Council for Climate, that had just published its first report and was saying that we urgently need to review all of our climate policies. And that got quite a good media coverage at the time. So people were saying yes. We would write their names, and mainly we would write how they would fill in the different criteria we had: gender, age, education level, employment, the type of territory, whether or not you live in the city center, in a semi-urban area, or in the countryside, and the geographic origins, so by regions, as you can see. And we kind of overrepresented the people coming from the overseas territories because they don't account in the general population for 1%. But it was quite important to make sure, especially due to the impact of climate change on those islands, that they were represented. It was also a bit hard through that method to reach out to specific groups like them or farmers or people with low incomes. So we also used organizations that had like specific phone books for farmers, for instance, to try to get them. Those were really the people during the last weeks where we were trying to get them and convince them to come. When you're a farmer and you need to take care of your cows or stuff like that, and you need to go away for 3 days, it's quite a heavy commitment. But I think you covered recruitment already yesterday, so I won't dwell on that. You may just notice that among the selection criteria, we didn't have one about ethnicity, because in France it's illegal, but we didn't have one about the attitude towards climate change. How did people felt that it was an emergency or not, or anything connected to that? I'll come back to that later on. So this is just an illustration of that diversity and how we were able, through this recruitment, and to have people coming from very different backgrounds. And just because I love the pictures from that time, they are like, I'm a bit emotional about them.
So, organization of the works. Basically, those are the 7 sessions that were organized.
Several things happened. The first being that there were strikes in France in December. We love strikes, you know that. So we had to move one session. And very soon we also realized that we needed an additional session. We didn't have a big plan when we started the assembly. We were building it as it progressed because we had so little time to prepare it. But that happened, and then, okay, March 2020, something else happened, and we have to move temporarily online. There is one session that is not on that chart, but that was held online in April 2020, where the members agreed to write. It was quite hard to do online, but to write a kind of communication about the connection between the COVID pandemic and the green transition. And they also agreed on a proposal from the governance committee to share some of the unvoted proposals they had been working on to the government, because the government was preparing its post-COVID growth shock package. And they felt that they had some proposals that were relevant for that. So it was shared with government. It was, of course, leaked. To this day, we don't know who leaked it. There are many suspicions. Everybody is pointing the finger at everybody. But that led to the fact that on the front page of Le Monde in May, we got like some proposals, and some of them were a bit, the whole country was discovering them. So it generated kind of expectations and attentions, and that led to the final session that was like a voting session only, debating and voting, to be very, very much mediatized. I've been working in politics and government for a couple of years now, and you dream, you know, of you have this big vote in the European Parliament, but nobody cares about it. For the first time in my life, we had that, and we had like media commentators outside saying like, and they just voted about the proposal on nuclear, blah, 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 and now they're moving to that one. That was a bit crazy. But I've been moving a bit too fast, so you probably know that by now, but the first sessions were very much dedicated to understanding the remit, understanding the issues behind that, and we had decided to have 5 groups work in parallel on several issues. So we had housing, food, industry and consumption, industry and production, consumption, and transport. The members were drawn by lot, so they could not pick, I want to go in that group because I'm a farmer. So you actually, at some point in the assembly, had some members of the group working on food saying like, we have this question, we're not sure it's a good idea to do that. Let's go get the farmer in the other group. And they would do that at some point in the assembly. It was really, really interesting. You know, that thing about trying to get the experiences of others. But then when you also work in several groups parallel to each other, we tried as much as possible to have moments where they would share what they were doing, how they were working, etc. But there was also a lot of trust among the groups. So ultimately, when they had to vote, they didn't know all the proposals, but they trusted that the other group next to them worked as well as they had, or they were as committed as they had. But it also led to members being interviewed by the media in the months after, etc., saying like, but you voted for that and it will tax some enterprises and they may lose some workers. And the member would be like, I don't know, I was working in the transport group, I was not aware of that. It was very hard. But that's about also what happened to members and how you need to follow up with members afterwards.
We had approximately 135 external speakers that were auditioned in total. At some point we had like a big speed dating market where they could go to one table and listen to an expert and ask questions for 15 minutes and then change table. That was interesting, very hard to organize, but also quite useful because at some point at the end of session 1, for instance, we asked them, who do you want to hear from? Not only people that we had picked as governance committee, but who they wanted to listen to. And among those people, there was this famous environment minister who resigned and came for session 3, sharing his views about what were the limitations of climate action in France, for instance. We had President Macron coming for session 4.
It was an oral commitment from the president to say that he would submit the proposals without filter to parliament or direct implementation or to referendum. So it meant, and he explained it when he came to the assembly during the 4th session, it meant that the proposals had to be as detailed as possible and written in a way that were already ready for the law. They could be passed through. And there is a big there are different ways to actually interpret that. We had understood that, but for him, it meant we had understood that they would not change anything and that Parliament would work directly on the proposals. But of course, the government had to work on that, and he explained that that's what it meant, etc., etc. So big debate, but that also explained why we took so much time, because we had to bring in legal experts that helped the citizens. They actually wrote. It's like when you're in Parliament and you write an amendment to change a law. So they actually wrote. So your proposal is to increase the share of organic food in canteens, public canteens, for instance. So this proposal, that means that you need to take the environment code or the public procurement code, and you need to write that instead of that. And basically, there are 500 pages because there's a lot of explanation, but you also have what we call those legal transcripts. And the members were free to take in the legal transcripts from the experts or not. So they would say, like, we feel it's not a good interpretation or a good translation of what we are trying to do. So some of the proposals have legal transcripts, some do not have them. It was an opt-out system as well. Anyway, so they started to work on proposals, I think, really as soon as session 3. They amended them, mostly online because of COVID, etc., and then they were voted in June. After the vote, wanted that. This is just a picture to illustrate. So the ESSEC is this institution that has a hemicycle. So we also had rooms for groups, etc. But they would have like sessions that looks a bit like the parliament. And we had the public, and it was open for anyone who registered. There were not that many places. But we also had some elected representatives and members of government coming. So the guy on the left, he's the economy minister, still is to that day, and behind him are several members of parliament from the majority group. And one of them told us, actually, after coming to that session and witnessing the debates, like, oh my God, if the debates in parliament had that quality, the country would be in a much better shape. But hey, they told us that at that moment, and 4 months afterwards, they were like, yeah, interesting idea, but they were not as representative as we thought. Maybe we should not listen to that, and plus, this trade union told me that. So anyway, it was a love story, but a short one. So in terms of outcomes, and this is a trickiest slide because everything needs to be on one, and it doesn't work, but anyway. So they adopted, I mentioned the interim communication, they adopted a final report that had 149 proposals. It was kind of a joke that they wanted to have one proposal per member because one actually was not voted. They didn't want it in the report finally, but it was pure hazard. And in truth, you have 149 proposals, but sometimes you have proposals within the proposals. It's a bit messy. It's 500 pages of very, very interesting, for anyone who can read French, like, if you want to believe in humanity, you have to read that. Plus, it's very interesting for I think, many people working in the field of climate policy, about the way the reading citizens can have on the very important controversies that we're just in the middle of at the moment. Following this vote, this formal vote that was attended by at the time, the environment minister, where she got the report and brought it back to the Élysée, where the president lives. Following that, we had very lively climate public debates about several proposals. And when I say it lasted for several months, in truth, it lasted for years. Last autumn, we were still discussing, or some media brought back some proposals that came from the report and that were not implemented, but because they were relevant to what we were going through in terms of energy crisis. So they have left a mark in the public debate in France. They have also moved a bit the way we talk about some things, for instance, private jets, private planes, or the fact to have, sometimes we have like internal flights between two cities where you can make the travel in less than 2 hours in France, and you still have those flights. So now, thanks to the CCC, they are banned. But the proposal was actually a bit more ambitious. They wanted to have no flights where you can do the trip in less than 4 hours, and not 2 hours. Anyway, so what's interesting was also, so they adopted the report on the 21st of June, and the president invited them to the Élysée just a week after, on the Monday, that was the 29th of June. That happened to be on the morning after an election where the presidential party got bad results and the Greens got good results, but that's purely coincidental. And he welcomed them. They got to present generally the intent of the report and what they had, and present the way they had worked. Everything was live on TV. And he said like he would take on board all the proposals but 3. And he explained why he didn't want to have them. One of them was actually the speed limitation on highways to go from 130 kilometers per hour to 110. And because that one had been a lot in the media, with many people reacting and drivers associations saying like, this is scandalous, we don't want that. It was becoming like a very hot point. Many members were a bit relieved to say like, okay, we understand why he doesn't want to go there. But some other members were quite disappointed. And you actually now have a movement in France of people who have 110 stickers, and they put that on their car to say like, I drive at this speed and this is for climate. So interesting, another indirect result of the CCC. Then what happened after this session was that the members of the Climate Assembly, and most of them agreed to do that, were invited to go to workshops with the different ministries and their administration and other stakeholders to prepare for a law, because the president had said, what can be implemented by law will go through a law, then we can implement directly some stuff. For others, we need a referendum. There were also a couple of proposals that had more to do about the position that France should defend at the EU level, especially stuff about trade policies, etc. And so they worked in those sessions that were a bit tough, because for the first time, they didn't have any facilitation or delivery organization by their side. The expert groups that had been with them were not there anymore. And they were a bit left alone in the room. It was also a bit hard for them, and this is a bit connected also to the embedding discussion earlier on, where it was quite interesting for policymakers to have in front of them the people that could explain the proposals and what they had meant and try to write and what was the intent. But it was also a bit tricky because the members could not, and sometimes they would or could do that, to say like, yeah, we said that, but I think it's better to do that. So it's also a bit hard. You go from being 150, having a very organized communication, and actually communication was really at the end about the proposals. Before that, we were talking more about the process, how things were going, what we were working on. But suddenly you have to talk about the proposals, and there is no safety net. There is no, you were supposed to defend the thing in front of people who are also experts. in this field for many years and say, so, you want to do that, but you're going to destroy that many jobs. So it's very hard for citizens to do that. It's a real question. Should members of an assembly do that afterwards? Anyway. We also had another meeting with the president in December because he felt like he needed to reassure them about how they were preparing the law. And then we had a review session, so last session of the assembly of the members. We did that online in February 2021, when a couple of weeks after the government had presented the law project. So it was named the Climate and Resilience Bill. At the time, the government also had published this tracker that I mentioned earlier, that is a sort of a big table with, this is a proposal, this is what we're doing, a bit more complex. And that was very aimed at reassuring the members that they were following up on stuff, etc. So we organized that session. It was very tough because by the time the members were not anymore like one group, you could see that some political views would come back. You could see that they also had different approaches about the way the government had worked with them, and they had different readings or analysis of what were the plans of the government, and the level of trust in the government also had decreased by the time due to many declarations from ministers who would distance themselves from the process. So this session was also organized with grades, very different from what the Scottish Assembly did. And this was probably something that was good or bad, depending on how you interpret it. But the 2.5/10, so it's a grade system in France, was like, it's very bad if you get that in France, was what they gave the government ultimately on the implementation of their proposals. And at the time, that's a picture, you had mobilization because the discussions in Parliament had started, and you had many people from the climate movement, youth groups, but not only, who protested and said like they wanted a true climate law and no babbling. So yeah, this is it. And you had the tracker that I mentioned earlier that's been updated, etc. And also by the time the Senate, who is held by not the presidential majority, but the right in France, had blocked the idea of a referendum to revise the constitution in the way that the Assembly had suggested. Okay, I'll skip over that. It's just some numbers that show that when the Assembly finished, we had a poll, but several polls showing that many people had heard about the process. There were clear majorities about the legitimacy of the process and the usefulness of the proposals. All but one of the proposals, the one about the speedway limit, were supported. So this is it. We're gonna have I'm gonna have a drink first, and then we're going to have a quick look on governance. So the governance structure of the French Climate Assembly was organized as follows. We had a governance committee with 15 representatives that came from government. We had 2 representatives one coming from the cabinet of the environment minister, and 1 person working in the high administration in the climate department. We also had representatives of think tanks, unions, business, and some people were experts in climate science, policy, or democracy. I, for instance, was working for the co-chair, the 2 co-chairs. One was was the head of a think tank that is quite close to power, and the other one was more was vouched by climate civil society because she's one of the architects of the Paris 2015 agreement. Sorry. Half of them came from the CESE or ESSEC, this institution that I mentioned earlier, and the other half was not, but with a majority on the non-CESE part. Plus the co-chairs were 2 members, as I said, coming from civil society, but not from ESSEC. I'll explain why I'm clarifying those points now. Plus, we asked 2 members of the Climate Assembly to join the governance committee. They were only able to join once the process started, so at the first session, and we proceeded by asking volunteers who wanted to join and help the work of the governance committee. That meant having at least 1 meeting a week, online or in Paris with us. And we had the first time we had more than 30 volunteers, and even more at the very end. And we would actually draw them by lot. And we had a system where they would change at every session, so for 3 to 4 weeks, and sometimes we had longer period of time between sessions. We would have the same group of people with us. So it meant actually my job was to pass to them documents before the sessions, before the governance committee meetings, and to explain what was at stake, what we were going to discuss. And they really acted as they provided us with use of you, saying this session went well, but that was a problem, we had too much time on that and not enough on this, etc. But they would also contribute on discussions about communication, about should we start working on that issue or not, etc., or should we change the way we do things. And in total we had, I think around 30 members, because at some point we also had more changes, that joined and who had this experience that was very interesting for them. They really enjoyed it, to be working within the governance committee. We also had 3 guarantors that were appointed by the ESSEC and the Senate and the National Assembly. Their role was not clearly defined. They were supposed to oversee the works. And one of them was actually a climate activist. The 2 others were coming from the administration of the institutions, so they had different styles, different views about their job. There was a good idea, I think, coming there from the Great National Debate, where you had those guarantors that were, from what I hear, incredibly useful and were specialists trying to set some rules on ethics, transparency, etc. The way our guarantors work was a bit different. We had 3 companies working on facilitation, and we also had, for in-house expertise dimension, a legislative or legal committee of 6 members coming from mainly academics or public institutions, and an expert group coming from think tank, academics, a couple of journalists who were experts in specific fields, and all together, or we would have 2 experts with the 2 different views of one issue. Let's say one that would be more pro-business and another one pro-legislation, maybe. It was a bit, we built those groups when the process had already started, because the governance committee was divided about whether or not we should have experts to help the members. And they arrived after the 2nd session, if I remember well. And all of them it was fully set up before the 4th session. So I just mentioned actually something that the governance committee was divided about, but there were many potential issues for division, just about when should we send this press release. Everything was an issue for discussion. And when you have 15, I'm not counting the members here, but when you have 15 bosses who do not agree, I guess you've already run a project, too many bosses, it doesn't work. So many times the decision making was really slowed or hampered. I remember the first discussions, we had meetings of 2 hours, and over the summer they went from starting at 9 and finishing at 11 to finishing at 6 p.m. So it was a bit hard, but then and plus the roles were not fully formalized with a guarantor, so everybody was trying to find its place. And then those were the downsides. The good sides here were the fact that we had a true diversity of expertise, political views as well, and connections. And also because we had to get the 135 experts, sometimes from one day for the other, it was quite helpful to have people coming from very different parts of society and who could say okay, I know who could come and talk about this and would be helpful, etc. But that was also sometimes a bit yeah, a bit tough. The fact also that there were different political views and different interests helped with a kind of, it pushed us towards transparency, trying to say like we need to be able to tell what's happening. On the first session, there was a big media piece about, oh, there is a representative of the mining industry sitting on that governance committee. So it also pushed us, and we realized that it's not because you say, yeah, you have that person, but then you have the climate activist on the other side that people are going to trust it. So it pushed us towards trying to explain more what was happening, opening the sessions where we could, still trying to protect the works of the members, but also we had to stay independent from the commissioning authority, from the government. So we had a couple of meetings with them during the process, like formally going to the Prime Minister's office and saying, this is where we are at, this is when we plan to finish, you need to get ready. So yeah, that was how it worked. But then, we don't know, there were probably conversations of some members of the governance committee with the government, but you also probably had some discussions of committee members with NGOs or the climate community, etc. So that was a way to try to build a form of trust. And then the inclusion of the user view I mentioned from the members. You have to bear in mind that this very strange, and you will see that is an uncommon governance structure, comes from the political negotiation, comes from where the Climate Assembly came from. It was a negotiation from a group of deliberative democracy activists, meeting with green activists, meeting with yellow vest representatives, and saying, we want a citizen assembly on, at the time I think it was democratic renewal, green transition, and cost of living. Small topics. But they pushed for that. You also had some people within the environment minister and within Macron's cabinet probably saying, like, we need something new, we need to find a solution to what's happening. It was a unique political crisis in France at the time, and they considered also that idea. You had people in other parts of society in the ESSEC who ESSEC had started to bring in some drawn by lot members to work on some reports with them. So everything was kind of converging, and those people ultimately ended meeting, convincing the president to hold the press conference and to announce it. And then once it was announced, they said, like, okay, so now we know we need to work on that. So I want to be in the governance committee, I want to decide, me too, etc. So negotiation, that's how you end up with this strange thing. For instance, the guarantors were also a way to say, like, we don't have Senate and Parliament in the room, they're going to be very unhappy about that. They will probably boycott the process. Okay, let's tell them they can have a guarantor. So that's how politics works most of the time. And that's how we ended up with this. So it was an interesting setting with some downsides, as I pointed. Oh yeah, just that was an illustration. The two co-presidents are on that side. In the middle, this is the member of the ESSEC who was sitting in the committee. That was the environment minister at the time, now she's prime minister. And then the president of the ESSEC at the time. That was, I think, yeah, the last session when she came to get the reports in hand. This comes from a very good briefing that I think was among the resources you probably received ahead from Dr. Jane Carrick, who worked with us at KNOCA and did a very good briefing about the governance structures and practices of climate assemblies. I would have added a couple of hours more, but then you cannot really read it. I think the main thing is you need to see that the governance committee was actually connected to all the bubbles and controlling kind of everything. It was also communicating to the media. It was actually responsible for doing press releases and updating the public about what was happening in the assembly. We also had a connection with, you don't see it here, but the commissioning authority should be there, actually. And you can see the two groups. The support team is the expert group, and the legislative committee is a legal group that helped with the legal transcripts. You can see that the delivery organizations are a bit on the side. It's true that it seems a bit like we are giving them orders and they would just execute. In practice, it was actually a bit different. But I have to confess that if you have the opportunity to talk with people at Mission Publique and Res Publica, they can tell you how annoying the governance committee was with them. Because nobody in the governance committee, actually we had 2 experts of deliberative democracy, but nobody knew anything about it before that. But we would not always listen to them when they told us, like, you should be careful about this for the well-being of members, etc. And in some occasions, we came close to having problems because probably we're not listening enough to the delivery team. That's also one downside of this organization. So other governance models, very quickly, Jane has, she has identified 3 structures, the very different one being the French one. There are the cases where you appoint an external practitioner or a delivery organization to design and deliver the assembly. You give them the roadmap, you say, this is what we want. You have like a public call for companies who comes and say like, okay, I want to do that. Okay, your plan is okay, let's do it. So that's Climate Assembly UK with Involve, the Klimarat in Austria with Ögut, and the Danish Climate Assembly with the Danish Board of Technology. Mark was the one presenting yesterday on recruitment. So this is how it works, even though in practice it's not about this is a roadmap and see you in 6 months. It doesn't work that way, really. But the power is much more important there for the delivery organization. Then you have the case where you have a secretariat. Graham, you're having a very strange way of looking at the slides. What's the problem? Sorry? Okay.
You're running a bit over.
Okay.
It's fine.
Okay.
It's fine. No, don't worry. It's
cool. I'll turn my back on you. You're really... No, so the secretariat comprising civil servants who are there to coordinate the delivery and to work with the delivery organizations. Then that's a case. That was a case in Scotland. That was a case in Ireland. That was the case on the last one in Ireland on biodiversity loss. Do you confirm, Graham? Yes. Yeah. So that's it. Those are the 2 systems. But then you could add one, and that one was not in Jane's briefing at the time, is also the case where you have a civil society organization who organizes the process. And then you don't have this commissioning public authority. And this commissioning authority is actually the one who runs it. Most of the time with partners, you bring in also people who have the savoir-faire, the know-how. And that was the case of the Polish Energy Citizens' Assembly. So those are basically 3-4 models, but then it varies immensely within those categories, because it's all about the control that the commissioning authority may want to retain, or that the secretariat or the governance committee, in the French case, wants to hold, and how much you balance and work with the delivery organization, for instance. It can evolve during the process also. At first, people, you don't know each other, etc. And then at some point you realize, like, these guys know what they do, so okay, let's let them do what they do. And then, sorry, just checking the notes. And then you can also have, we are seeing things evolve, and there will be hybridations between probably those different models as we have new assemblies popping up, and I'm sure at the local level it can also be a bit different as well. So to finish, the main takeaways. I do believe that actually government is really the litmus test of whether or not the commissioning authority is serious about having a climate assembly and take the proposals on board or trying to do something about them afterwards. It's also quite a good test about whether or not you're able to engage with other groups that are relevant to climate policy or to public policies in general. If people turn their back and you end up doing that on your own, alone in a corner, chances are impact could be very limited at the end. So I would say that governance is important, really, in that way. Plus, it will make you, if you have a good governance system, your life will be easier to organize a process. 9 months can be a very, very long time. In terms of recommendations, I think that it's always easier to say than to actually implement that in reality, I have to be honest. But you need to set up and very early to think about how you can make those arrangements robust, how you can show independency from the commissioning authority. Independency doesn't mean that you don't trust the commissioning authority, but you need to think sorry, you need to think, and that's among the questions to consider, how this climate assembly and the governance will be understood from the outside. But we'll come back to that. You need to formalize roles and responsibilities, and I think it's among the OECD recommendations, so when you talk about deliberative many publics. But still, I would say that you need to allow for adjustments. You need to be able to be flexible, because the plan, you have the plan, and then there is reality. And then that's my take on really the French Climate Assembly. It was still an asset to have a broad range of point of views, expertise, and interests among the table, around the table, when you organize the process. But then, everybody doesn't need to be at the decision-making table, or not about all the same. The decision-making can be about press, communication, can be about the internal works, can be about other things. Anyway. And this is really the end. So those are maybe discussions that I would recommend or advise that you consider about your own projects or plans or what's ongoing for you at the moment, to stop and think about how the Climate Assembly can be understood, as I said, from an external point of view. Governance is most of the time kind of a figure. You make the decision, but you tend to appear. The media are going to report saying, those are the people who are organizing that. Can be very important. You need also to make sure that the governance arrangements are kind of transparent and at least clear, because if it's too complex, okay, you're going to present the process to many people before, during, after. You need to have a brief, a pitch, like in 30 seconds people can understand. It's not like a 30 minutes presentation like I just did, for instance, where it's like, oh yeah, but this person then calls that person, and then you have the recruitment, etc. Then it's really about what are the various roles that you can have during a process, and I'm sure that you probably mentioned liaison officers or people or stuff like that. There are roles that actually have been, that didn't exist at the time of the French Climate Assembly, and that others have tried in Austria, etc. And it's really interesting that I think there are many new roles to invent. You need to think about who are the people in the room when you decide to have this assembly, and say, like, most of the time those people want to stay in the room for the process or close by, but you need to think about who is not there and could be an added value to make the process impactful. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.